Well, dates are obviously all year round because once they're dried, they last quite well. But
I do like dates.
It's coming from the UK. It used to be the thing you could only buy at Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
So it was one of the things that, particularly, although I'm not quite old enough to remember the sort of the overflow or the run on of the restrictions on the food post World War II. I'm not quite that old. I do remember things like bananas disappearing because the boat hadn't arrived that week. And of course, British bananas at that point were all Caribbean. Because we didn't buy from South America because that was America Fruit or Fruit America, whichever it was.
United, yeah.
And so walnuts were also pretty much exclusively Christmas.
Seasonal?
As were sultanas. Not sultanas, satsumas.
Okay, yes. That's a big, that seems to be a big kind of a Christmas stocking British thing, isn't it? Satsumas. Yeah.
And now, of course, globalization has meant it's not just bananas, but plantains on display. And it's like somebody the other day commented about, you must be really short on food here. This is a Brit friend who'd not travelled here. So I said, yeah, I went past my local Waitrose, which is a British supermarket that's here. And I can only choose from 9 different varieties of mango.
Yeah.
Plus apples, plus pears, plus pineapple, plus star fruit, plus dragon fruit, plus, the oddball thing, of course, is a lot of the prices are inverted. So one of the most expensive things you can get from the greengrocers is kale, because it's so heavy relative to water and its food value. And it's a cold weather cropping relatively only out of Northwest Europe.
Yeah.
Whereas I can get Chinese apples and pears. The one fruit you can't get is durian.
Is what?
Durian, which is the really smelly.
Oh, the stinky fruit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's stinky. You can't. You've got to be in Malaysia or Singapore to get that. But if you could, a bit like medicine, if you can get past the aroma as you're about to eat it, the taste is superb. But you see all the taxis and the metro and the hotels won't let you take it back. So you buy it in the shop and you have to eat it practically outside because you can't get in a metro and you can't get in the taxis with it because it does stink rather. We have a sign. We used to have a sign here that was near one of our metro stations that says no carrier bags of fish next door to the fish market. So that was a taxi only thing because it was too far to walk, and it was across from where I used to live and was visiting there relatively frequently. It was across the creek, and there's no real footbridge until you get like a mile down the creek to cross over from one side to the other. There's a tunnel, and there's a vehicle only bridge, but to actually walk, you've got to go to like the second down bridge. And you can't do that at night because they submerge it so that the boats can get through.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's called the submersible bridge, and it's quite a freaky thing to watch. So you sort of come sundown, it sort of starts to sink, and it just and then the dhows can get in and out of the dock.
Wow, interesting.
Rather than lift it up like Tower Bridge in London or something.
Right, yeah. So I'm sorry about last week. I actually had sort of planned to kind of go ahead with the meeting, which is why I left it to the last minute. Then I sort of realized that I needed to kind of be there to, whatever, organize and do my role in the family gathering. It was a nice gathering. The ice actually went off the lake during the weekend. So when people arrived, they still got to see some ice on the lake, and then the wind changed and all the ice blew to the shore, the western shore that we were on, and then it melted. And then on the final evening, myself and my daughter and my son-in-law actually ran into the lake and did a little cold plunge. So that was fun. And I tried to make it. I tried to make it all the way to 3 minutes, and I got to about 2 minutes and change, and I got out of the water. But it was.
You can only hold your breath for the 2 minutes, and then you're done, huh?
It was actually I do end up doing a lot of hard breathing. I do the kind of thing, as a sort of a coping thing. It's really the first 30 seconds, I think, when I'm doing it in the shower, that is really the shock, and then I kind of get used to it. But this was the complete immersion. The water was probably about 35 degrees, so it was a little bit more intense than a shower, I guess.
So warm water.
Warm.
So, and I realized you were talking Fahrenheit.
No, yeah, I was talking Fahrenheit. Yeah, so it was just above freezing, and I think 35 Fahrenheit is the temperature that most of the cold plunge addicts kind of advise or recommend.
I made the silly mistake of visiting Finland and Helsinki in particular in mid-January, and the UK, the British host for the business trip, was a winter swimming freak. So in the UK, one of the things that they do Christmas week is they swim Lake Windermere, which is the UK's biggest lake.
Mm-hmm.
So not quite the size of.
I think I sort of made a pilgrimage there when I was on my rail trip.
4, maybe 5 miles across, maybe 10 miles long. So it's a backwater. It's not like Lake Huron or something. You can see both. You can see both shorelines. It's not that.
Right. No, I think we went to places like Windermere and because we wanted to go to the Lake District, and Snowdon and also
Snowdon's in Wales. So that's...
Right. Yes. But we were just getting on and off trains, so it wasn't much of a thing to us. And then we actually did take the train all the way across to Skye, and so that was kind of a fun trip.
Okay, so did you take the train up Snowdon or just past it?
I don't know. We didn't go up it. No.
Okay, because it's the Rack and Pinion one that's useful to come down if you've expired yourself trying to climb up. Anyway,
yeah.
The Helsinki thing was, so he took us to what was then maybe not there anymore, because it's a few years back, the Sauna Institute that has like 10 different flavors and type styles of sauna. He and I were sort of the rough end of the group who sort of half chickened out, and he and I did them all. So we got smoky ones, steamy ones, hot, really hot ones, cooler ones, bits where they beat you with birch twigs and all that sort of plant. And of course, between it and what you really should be doing is 5 or 6 minutes maximum in the sauna, then get a cold dip.
Yep.
Unlike most of the hotels in Helsinki, this place didn't have any plunge pools.
Oh.
Why? Why? Because it's on the coast. You're supposed to jump off the pier.
Nice.
This is like the second week of January. You could almost walk to the town of Tallinn. Back then, it was still the Soviet Union. across the ice. Unfortunately, the ice is all broken up. It's like a slush puppy drink.
Mm-hmm.
And being salt water, it means that it's like -3 centigrade. So that's like 26, 27 Fahrenheit, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
And water. So it sucks the heat out even worse than a wind.
Yeah.
Thing.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that was good fun. He was quite a short guy, but very broad. He jumped in, and I sort of dived in the hole that he left in the ice. And then when we were swimming along a bit, of course, the slushy ice won't get out of the way. So it just sort of builds up. The next thing you know is your arse is waving in the air because it just pushes you out of the water. So that's the time to turn around and come back.
Yeah. Yeah. We're going to, we'll be going, the family will be going to Iceland in a few weeks. And one of the things we have scheduled is swimming in a place where there's supposed to be this very, very deep chasm beneath you that is where the plates are separating or whatever, right? So you're looking down into the deep depths, and the water there is supposed to be very cold. So we're gonna have to wear dry suits. So this is not one of the office cats. This is Max, and he is he's an indoor-outdoor guy, but he likes to come here to eat the food that I give to the office cats.
Oddly enough, that chasm with which has got very, very clean, clear water because most of it's bubbling up, happened to be part of a topic that was on the interview by Tim Ferriss. Within the last month. So he was interviewing Derek Shivers, who, when he went to Iceland, learnt to scuba dive so he could do the dive into that chasm.
Yeah, we're going to stay on the surface. We're just getting snorkel gear and dry suits.
Yeah, but he has quite a story about doing it with some Europeans who were supposedly experienced divers, at least one of whom panicked because it's so clear and yet so deep. You're not seeing the usual color change and darkness as you go deeper.
I'm a little bit nervous about that, to tell you the truth, because I did some snorkeling off of Hawaii and Maui in particular, and that was the thing that scared me. I liked the coral, I liked looking at the fish and stuff, but then when I swam out to the edge and it just went down, and just looking, watching the sand just drop and the blue turn to dark. Just scary. That was scary to me.
So. Yeah, I swam off the Canary Islands, but just swimming. And the issue there was because of a volcanic island similar to Hawaii, the beach sand and the beach shape is so steep. You have to time your exit, otherwise you'll always get pulled back. But scuba diving off of reefs where it goes from atoll, you cross through a hole in the reef or a gap, and then you see the drop and the colour change of the sea is exhilarating. I've done it off of the Maldives a couple of times.
Yeah.
And not off a reef, but off a what I suppose must be a volcanic plug in the Bay of Thailand. And you do the reverse there. They take you to the bottom of the mount, which is 60, 70 feet above sea level. They take you to the bottom, which is maybe 50 meters deep, put you in a hole, and you swim up inside the rock. I mean, there's another hole just below the surface, and you can come back out. At that point, you go, if I get stuck, there's no easy way to get me out because I'm inside effectively a castle turret full of, there's a couple of meters of rock around me.
Yeah.
So that's what I found that more scary than getting stuck in a wreck.
Yeah.
Which I've done out here, but.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
on that note, maybe we should switch to the book.
Yeah.
So one thing on kind of the water, the sort of apropos of the water thing, I was not at all aware of this Bill Phillips Moniac device that she mentions as this sort of visual or mechanical hydraulic version of the circular flow at the beginning of chapter 2. It did, and it didn't really impress me that much, except I thought that the metaphor of having to plug it in was so powerful. I thought that was, I just thought, oh, that was smart.
Yeah.
That was good writing.
The thing powers itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And and that idea of not accounting for that, and then she sort of immediately gives Paul Samuelson an out, saying he was really just focusing on the flow of income, so he was probably aware of these other things, but they weren't an important part of the thing.
The other thing we have to remember too, at that time they were living in a much more clockwork viewpoint world. So even, I think he wrote his economics book in 1948, which was the same year that Vannevar Bush's As We May Think came out in July in the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And roughly up until that point, he's overseeing or had overseen within the last decade Claude Shannon do his master's thesis. He didn't oversee the master's thesis, I don't think, but he oversaw his PhD work. And he was having Claude Shannon build a plumbing, pipes, hydraulic computer. And it had only been until Claude Shannon's master's thesis literally was, and you can read it now as a kind of an advanced high school student. He literally takes Boolean algebra and translates it into this algebra works in electronics.
Mm-hmm.
And that's in the late 30s when he's getting his master's thesis. And it's probably, I think, it's not only a seminal work in and of itself, but it's got to have been the most influential master's thesis ever written. And you can read it and it's phenomenally readable now.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you think, hey, this is what would get you a master's at MIT in the 30s, like,
right,
you will read it and you'll be floored, like, oh my God, I could have written this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So but it was totally the state of the art of a lot of computers at that time was still, people were still building hydraulic models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At that point. So
yeah, and it's interesting that there are other ways, than kind of digital switching to think about these things, and it reminds me, as you're saying that, Chris, it reminds me of Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age, right? Because they, as Nell is getting, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but this young girl gets this book that teaches her. It's a artificially intelligent interactive book, and it teaches her, and she becomes this, really by the end of it, kind of a superhero. But she learns computing, and she learns it by way of chains and rods, and and part of the charm of that is that in a nanotech world, rods are again sort of valid mechanical, sort of atom scale mechanical devices that that could be relevant in in computational work.
It's the same with old valve televisions with relays and that type of technology. And even in my relative short time in the control side of buildings, you still come across older buildings that have relay technology doing the day-to-day control. It's not all digital, although everything I've done new the last 20 years has been digital, and slowly getting more and more sophisticated and more cross-linked from one major system to another. So heating systems now talk to lighting systems that now talk to door systems, etc., etc. But the Moniac maybe laugh a little bit in some respects, because we still do that engineering wise when we can't be bothered to work the maths out. We build a model, physically build a model, and then say, how do we test it? So one of the places you get that a lot is in coastal work, getting back to the spas. The coastal erosion and coastal deposition is quicker and easier to do as a scaled model. That's why we still do things in wind tunnels and similar with aircraft and in buildings even. It's quicker, easier, more variations very quickly.
Another thing right at the very beginning of this chapter that interested me was kind of beginning it with Shakespeare and and this whole this whole thing that she does with the play. And I was fascinated by the idea that Shakespeare maybe didn't let his actors know what the other actors were going to say. Of course, once you've performed it once, I suppose the novelty of that wears off. But it must have been kind of interesting for the first, for the first run through, that you wouldn't, and if you didn't have the whole script to read, you wouldn't be able necessarily to really kind of study the other characters and think about their motivations that much, which may be more of a kind of an analog to the real world. But then she kind of does this very elaborate, maybe too elaborate, kind of 20th century neoliberal playbill, and then the 21st century Doughnut playbill. What did we think of that?
Looking back on it, she kind of admonishes the originators for creating this play up front. And then I don't think she says it's a wrong framing to do, because then she turns around and does her own framing and does the same type of behavior. So the first thing I thought after I had finished the chapter was, has she now done us a disservice for the next 200 years?
Yeah.
For 100 years, after this becomes the new, this is the new play, and it's great and it's fine. And it's been, in some sense, brewing, especially in the Santa Fe Institute has a very complexity theory based economics program, been running since like the early 90s. So it's been shifting, but in a very small niche, and I think it's shifting faster and faster. But I think you would be hard pressed to find a Doughnut economics perspective textbook, or even, standard. I'm kind of tempted to now go look at what, Harvard and University of Chicago are using as introductory economics textbooks, but I can't imagine they're this. Or
no,
that
Harvard is still using Greg Mankiw's
yeah,
basic
that's
text.
I can't imagine they're using a reframing that even says complexity as like, here's a major area of research in the field now, or that you would get to that until like the sophomore or junior year maybe. But I thought she's done the same framing that they have done ostensibly for the last 75 years. Are we starting the cycle over again, or is there some yet even more complex version of what's going on? And the model will have 100 years hence. We'll look back and say we made a big step forward in 2017,
right?
But still, that's even more interesting than we are going to give it credit for.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think you're right. I think that there's a lot of reliance on on kind of systems theory, right? Which, kind of comes out of that, is really, ironically, also a very 1960s kind of a thing. So it's not, it's not necessarily, that we've entered the 20th century.
And guess where that stuff started as well? It's in the late 30s, early 40s. John von Neumann and Norbert Wiener literally start to lay the groundwork for what becomes systems theory at that same time.
Right.
And they're literally colleagues and friends with Claude Shannon and Vannevar Bush, and are coming out of that same little workspace.
Yeah. And so it does seem like it is firmly kind of rooted in that. Well, as do the people who, kind of led the whole Club of Rome limits to growth thing, the Meadowses, right? So they're all sort of from that, they're sort of a different take on that same thing. It does seem like over, maybe in Europe, elsewhere, right? We are, in the 70s at least, we are beginning to get chaos theory as well, right? So, and I don't see, sort of thermodynamics, at least yet, I don't see kind of thermodynamics and chaos theory, kind of making an appearance in this, which it would seem like they would also have, something to say about, at least things like, sensitive dependence on initial conditions and, and tipping points and, kind of nonlinear change, which
but the economics
would be valuable. Go ahead, Tim. Sorry.
But the economics that we see and the way that the market still supposedly works is to ignore the fact that there is ultimately an absolute boundary of the planet, for instance. She, right at the end of chapter 2, the last 5 paragraphs, the last 3 paragraphs, right after she's got the last heading of raising the curtain, there's a good little summary, but just above that, it's like, where is the politics? Where is the actual governance? And the last previous 2 or 3 paragraphs is all about the business, money, and politics again. So in terms of this group, that's come up almost in every book in one form or another, for one reason or another, and it's elements of, literally this week in the UK, there's one private operator that has performed so badly, they're going to take away that railway line and put it back into the government's hands. It's going to be effectively renationalised. But just one set of tracks in that instance. Except, of course, the word nationalisation never crossed the paths of any of the Tory politicians talking about it. And I know it's not our book, it was one of the things that got mentioned in the discussion about what book to read, and was part and parcel of one of the chapters from our previous book with Orestes and Conway, where they've done the big myth of the way that business has corrupted politics. And this second chapter finishes pretty much with, but that's no different in some respects to Europe, as in, I think the quote is something like 90% of the meetings held in the European Parliament are not with constituents as such, but with corporate lobbyists.
Corporations, yeah. Who are the new first-class citizens, really?
Say again, who are?
And it's the corporations that are having all these meetings who actually, that sort of demonstrates that they are now the first-class citizens of these new, of the EU. And so, so I wonder also, kind of with the circular diagram, when you have so much concentration of, wealth and as well as annualized incomes, what does that do to this model, right? Where it's supposed to be consumption that kind of fuels, if you look at the way this is drawn, even in her, where is it? Back up to the drawings that she does on page 56, at least in my PDF, right? That there's, that consumer spending is supposedly the big thing, right? Well, how much of GDP actually, produces products that consumers buy nowadays, versus things that, that are consumed in further production, that are what do you call it? Factors, right, of later stages of production, or go into or are bought by governments, like military supplies and things like that. It seems like we're deliberately ignoring the fact that that the part of this that is consumer production is shrinking, I would imagine, every decade, and yet we still argue about this model. The later one that she does, again, it's on my page 62, maybe different in the real book, with it has the energy inputs and it has the waste outputs, and it even has materials coming from the periphery. I like the fact that this is that this actually kind of also sort of mimics that sort of center periphery idea, right? Where the economic action is happening in the center and the raw material inputs and the waste sinks are in the periphery, because that's sort of the way that anti-colonialists have sort of imagined it for generations. But
it's certainly not honest in terms of, even if you treat it as a sort of prey-predator balance, that obviously both need water. So lions tend not to eat zebras at the waterhole, but crocodiles might, type thing. But the natural complexity, I don't think, comes through, and I don't think the the isolation and the binding up of money that the rich do compared to the bulk of the people who may not be quite as bad as being living from paycheck to paycheck, but the vast majority of people are not that far off. You know? And that's why the COVID shutdown, for instance, was such a big thing. And of course, therefore, the government's instant reaction is even here. As soon as the lockdown started, they said, okay, everybody can have debt relief for mortgages, medical, schools, and a couple of other things. So there was literally a government announcement that was then echoed by all the bank PR, is that if you're paying a mortgage for your home, as opposed to you're paying a mortgage to buy a property to let, it becomes therefore a business. And whoever's living there is probably still living there. If it's for your home, then you can have a deferment on your mortgage, which will be free of interest and free of charges. And it was just literally a top-down imposition from the government that said, that's what got to happen. And I think one of the memes that was floating around, I noticed in the last couple of months, was the graphic, a two-part graphic of this is what people think the pie chart looks like of the rich, the middle class, the working class, as in being almost a 1/3 each in terms of the numbers of people involved. Whereas the numbers of people involved is really this, the rich is really this, a fraction of 1%. The middle class is a decent sized fraction of 3 or 4%, and the rest is working class or non-working class, as in paupers, stroke pension, stroke people who don't have a cash income. So, house working wives, stroke mothers, they're not counted in the GDP. Right? The work they do, and this has mentioned it, and the several instances of in the last book I mentioned, it's still far too simple a model.
Right.
The UN sustainability goals that have graphics a bit like in chapter 3 and others are at least starting to try and break that circle as being a perfect circle.
Yeah.
In some respects, making the diagram a little bit less pure, for want of a better way of putting it. And so, and the same as some of the more recent climate stuff that's coming out, saying just how you mentioned tipping points in passing. The climate side wise, there are things that will happen. Once they happen, they're not cyclical. They can't go back.
Right.
Not without an extreme other event.
Right.
That is either extreme as in a volcano type explosion, or extreme as in 200 years of degrowth and deindustrialization to reverse what's happened ever since the Iron Bridge went on.
Yeah. Well, I think a couple things. I want to go back, Tim, to what you said at the beginning about predators and prey. I think that's an interesting metaphor, but I think it's a limited metaphor as well, kind of for two reasons. First, you mentioned, the lion, is it the lion or the alligator that's going to get the zebra, right? So there are multiple predators in kind of this, even in this thing that we're looking at and we're analogizing from. But I think even more relevant is the fact that people switch roles in human society, right? You can be prey and a predator simultaneously, or you can shift from being prey to being a predator and then back again, right? Depending on circumstances and who else is around, right? So
the lion is a prey for the alligator. If the crocodile grabs its muzzle and pulls it into the watering hole, because the crocodile lives there, the lion only drinks. But so the natural world still has multiple.
Yeah,
roles.
it does. But I think even because we don't kind of think that through and remember that happens in the natural world, I think we tend to think that we can classify people as either sort of victims or perpetrators, right? In a way that that may not that may work some of the time, but that may not ultimately really kind of be all that useful. The other thing that struck me was I've begun listening to maybe just because we didn't meet last week and I didn't have to listen to another batch of chapters from this one. I started listening to another book which is called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century by Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein. They're married couple of evolutionary biologists. Brett Weinstein is the brother of Eric Weinstein, the sort of dissident mathematician physicist. And that was interesting because that and you reminded me of that, Tim, when you were talking about sort of the poor, the other 97 or 96% or whatever, and the things that we because Rayworth has used the term weird, right, to describe Western, kind of this world that we live in, and they also, so it must be a fashionable word. So Heying and Weinstein use weird in the same term. Right, that when university researchers do research on university undergraduates, it's a weird population, and we don't kind of take account for that. And one of the examples they used was the appendix, the organ, which we think of or traditionally have sort of thought of as this vestigial thing that that just causes us problems, and at least sort of in the developed first world it does. But they kind of go on to say that but in the rest of the world it doesn't, right? Because in the rest of the world where people regularly get diseases that that basically flush out their intestinal biota, the flora, right, the symbiotic things, bacterium that are living in us, right? The appendix is like a side, it's like a place where they're stored, right? And so there's kind of it's like it's like having a little bit of a starter, a culture to restart your sourdough or whatever if it gets killed. And in the rest of the world where people are seed bank, thanks Mark, where people are regularly having these enteric kind of dysentery or whatever, that kind of flushes these things out, that and as a result nobody in the third world gets appendicitis. It never happens. Right. And so this might be this might be something that we and they talk a lot about things like what's his name, Chesterton's fence, right? G.K. Chesterton had this metaphor of I will, if you come to me and say there's this fence with this gate across a road and I want to tear it down, and I have no idea what it's for, I won't let you do that until you go away and study it and understand what it's for, and then I may let you take it down. But that's a kind of, it's an expression of kind of the precautionary principle. So I think that, kind of going back to donut economics, yeah, I guess where that leads me, Chris, is to what you were saying, that this is, maybe just another slightly better, but again, kind of incomplete model that, may cause us problems if we believe it too fully for too long. But in the meantime, might be a step in the right direction. I did like, introducing Eleanor Ostrom. I really should. I'm kind of trying to put it on my list of things to do this summer, to actually read some of her stuff and sort of incorporate it more directly. I'm rewriting my American environmental history textbook this summer, so maybe I'll do a little side chapter on that.
If it helps you, she's been on my list to read a good chunk of as well. So
yeah,
put her on our books to read list, and
or maybe if there's just a good, kind of powerful article that kind of is not too technical, and it's, sort of the main thing, that might even be something that I could have my, have students read, because this course, the way that I'm going to teach this course next is going to be at a, kind of a junior senior level. So I could make them read an article or two, possibly.
It's a kind of an interesting, empowering thing that she does, and it goes throughout the book. And I only noticed because I did a heavy skim of the book before we started reading it. But if folks haven't noticed, and it might be something to pay attention to as you go through, she starts out the book with a quote: "The most powerful tool in economics is not money, nor even algebra. It is a pencil, because with a pencil you can redraw the world."
Yeah.
And then the last line of the book, on page 249, is, "It's easy to get started. Just pick up a pencil and draw," which kind of invites the reader to play along. But she kind of is repeating this thesis in fits and spurts throughout the book, and I haven't searched through it to find all the mentions, but she ends the first section of chapter 2 with, "Armed with nothing more than a pencil by redrawing its most prized picture." So she's got this idea of using a pencil to redraw how we think about the world is an ongoing theme. And I'm pointing it out mostly so we can kind of watch her do this if you haven't noticed it's happening kind of in the background. And it's in part because of the way I'm reading the book and how I'm taking notes on it, that this has popped up, or that I've noticed it, or it's become super obvious that it's there. And I don't think I would have probably noticed it otherwise, or wouldn't have noticed it until much, much later. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it jumped out at me too. And I think it was partially because I was in this, last semester I was in this course, this economic history course, where we were jumping back and forth. The other instructor was an economics professor, and so so I was doing these little units on on kind of the historical events, and then he was going back to the to the graphs, and kind of take a look at at what Keynes said about moving the the aggregate demand curve during the Great Depression and things like that. And that was interesting because I think that is very much the way the whole pencil thing and the drawing, and the graphics are so central to, and I think she makes that point really early, right, when she's talking about Samuelson and how he and his the people who were sort of encouraging him to write that textbook were all about making it, that equations were for professional economists and graduate students, right? And diagrams were for undergraduates, who weren't going to be economics majors, and ultimately for the general public, right? And so it becomes this huge element of how we communicate these economic insights to the outside world. And I've always been really fascinated with, with sort of the communication of complexity to, to generalists or to people who aren't, who are just sort of interested lay people.
Well, it's like the stained glass windows in the early
Yeah.
church.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have something there for the people who don't speak Latin, don't read Latin. You give them some music and you give them some pretty pictures to meditate on while they're,
Yeah.
staring at the church, bored to tears.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
She has an interesting notion, though, I think, about the kind of people that economists are. There's that, is it in chapter 3? She does that section where she talks about the research on economists, indicating that very few of them, or fewer than normal, donate to charities, for example. And that started me thinking about that. The other kind of Zoom group that my wife and I participate in consists of, and it got started during the COVID thing, because all of us were kind of locked down, of a bunch of people we knew from college who, the commonality was that they were all hall advisors, and my wife was a trainer of these kids who functioned in the halls to, the residence halls to do this.
Right. Yeah.
Right, our age. And so these people that, are now adults, well, I guess they're adults then, but, and there's a woman who's a vice president of Goldman Sachs. There's a guy who's an economist at University of Houston, I think it is. And then there's a couple others that have financially oriented careers. And, and that struck me because there is some legitimacy, I think, in her notion about types. And and it always reminds me of the accusations so many people recently make about college professors as being liberal, and these innocent kids go off and are tainted by the exposure to these liberals. But then I start thinking about, what in this relationship between vocation, and I don't know what you call it, personality or values, is it that people select interest areas based on certain values? And so the economists of the world are people that get into the accumulation of, now that's another side story. The guy from Houston works with a lot of not so wealthy people and non-white people, and he talks about, he has this kind of club of, he's perpetuated over the years. He's taught about people who've made it to $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
And he has kind of this award, and so that when you make it, he kind of passes that down generation to generation among his students, about this golden life, and that he grants this reward. You follow his system of careful management of your money and accumulation of money, and again, to try to, I suppose, encourage his system among the future generations of students, that his students from the past have achieved this life goal. And because, right, as I understand, you talk about the pencil and whatever, her big thing, or part of it, is economists maybe are overly influential, and they are traditionally of a type because of their framework and whatever, and it's leading us astray, and a different type of model, a different type of mentality, a different type of personality might result in, I don't know, more equitable outcomes, or something like that. And what's interesting, you talk about all the books you're reading at the side. I happen to be reading Bernie Sanders' book. And his new book is It's Okay to Be Angry at Capitalism, or something. I think that's close to the title. And it just seems to fit very well with with this book. We need different values. We need to look at things differently.
I think that came out really powerfully in that section around page 104 to 106, where she's talking about nudging and how the nudging is done sort of ineptly or with blinders on, at least, that it's not, that we're maybe not understanding exactly, and by sort of framing things in a particular way where
even getting away from money in general. I mean, in past weeks, I said, I like the idea of carbon offsets, and that was a financially oriented way to think about saving the environment. And as maybe I'm getting ahead of us, but she gets into this thing, the extrinsic reward system fails eventually. Which is the big thing in psychology, the intrinsic, extrinsic motivational comparisons.
Right.
But that's when she starts talking about nudging.
So she continues with that. She develops that more later on.
Right.
Okay, good.
Well, the whole idea that intrinsic value, how do you get to intrinsic values? How do we inculcate in students and ourselves a commitment to something other than accumulating wealth and whatever. And so that has to be an intrinsic value. And the only way as far as I've read in the book, the only prescription she has for how to accomplish that is this nudging notion that we need to hold each other accountable to higher values or group oriented values or something of that nature.
Right. Yeah, I think go ahead, Tim.
The other thing on that, because aside from prescription, which is just about the same place in the book where she talks about nudges and stuff, with the UK NHS, brings to mind a couple of other bits and pieces, some of which, in part, even stems right back to pick up more of what Mark just said about the judgment stroke prescription of people. We go back to the early, I think it's still in the introduction, not even chapter 1, she talks about the various rebellions by the students over being taught the old style economics. And it sort of struck me then slightly, but it struck me even more now with what Mark just said. Are types of people who seem to comply very tightly to a certain stereotype, is that because of the way that we teach the profession, or is it because they've self-selected to do that profession? How did they know that they would be that type of person? When you're 16 years old, you've got to decide what advanced levels you do to get to university. How do you know? So one of the things that struck me was the much the same as we've commented a couple of times about the Obsidian and its graph, for instance, which I've persistently said when you look at the whole graph, aside from the prettiness of, yes, it's the new fractal, so I don't need Mandelbrot sets anymore. I just need a new Obsidian thing. As in, yes, but what the hell do you get out of it? And nobody yet has said anything to convince me that it's nothing but a load of fireworks. It dawned on me that the way that Dan was speaking, like a comment before last, about the graphics and the neatness, even when it's done with a pencil via Chris sort of thing, was, and Obsidian aside, because obviously Excalibur and Excalibur comments and whatever they've added in, and the canvas thing is all beefed up with graphics there. There's a whole series of books by Ostwalder and several people that could joint author with him that are trying to go through economics and business and auditing a company or forming a company, doing a business plan, and they've all been A4, but they've all been A4 landscape.
Mm.
And they've all been very cartoony, sketchy type books. And yet they're talking, for the most part, in exactly the same stuff that is done, partly because it came up in that conversation about people who read the numbers, who read the digital models, and look at the numerical methods of calculating. They may not be doing the calculus, but they're doing the numerical methods for solving calculus at the simplest extreme, Newtonian approximation type things that you do at ordinary level maths, and you touch again on that. And there's a whole bunch of books with combinations of three guys. One's Albright, one's Winston, and the other one is Zappa. And they, I think their first book, that's now in like 10th edition or something stupid, that was sold in the bookshops together with a Excel add-on called At Risk that allowed you to put a distribution. You chose which distribution, linear, normal, skewed belt, triangular, whatever, into all the squares, and you put the parameters in, and then you let it run through a few thousand iterations, following the same sort of ideas that came from the chaos theory, to redo this calculation with slightly different beginning conditions to see what the output would be as a heat map or a other sort of graph. And so far within the book, there's been nothing talking about the degree of which the sophistication of the model gets you, even though they're talking about values and heuristics and networks and stuff, they're still talking about elements that, to me so far, I've read as being almost back of envelope equivalents of Excel, not a true, real, sophisticated thing. And it's like I was talking to a friend of mine who works for a research group that is in the next level of doing climate modelling. And it's like the current version is using a kilometre cube. So it wraps the planet round in kilometre squares and then goes up through the atmosphere at a kilometre size.
Yeah.
Their next thing is, we want to do it at 10 meters. And the sheer up of the computer power that needs, it means that what takes them a day on renting a big supercomputer to get an answer out is going to take them more than a week, and they just can't afford to dosh to then say to the rest of the team, sorry, mate, we've used the budget up for the next 6 months or whatever.
Yeah.
And I wonder just how much given things, how rough and ready some of these models are, and we go back to things like the GDP and things like the retail price index, which I think from memory we covered in that book on poverty before we did Piketty. Once those simple models get to be agreed, the next step by all parties, all stakeholders, all people interested in the model, is how can I game it to make the answer come out the way I want it to come? And so it even, to me, it even smacks of how do I design this year's 10-year census form to allow me to gerrymander as voting blocks again?
Yeah.
Right thing. It's an instant response. And by quirk of fate, the other one, the final bit there's been a recent flurry of people talking about accusing physicists, particularly, of reducing a cow down to a circle. And for other reasons, I just bumped into the Lawrence Krauss lecture where he starts off with the talk about we don't teach estimation in school anymore. So I'm going to give you a lecture. So rather than use a PowerPoint, I'm going to teach you how to estimate various bits and pieces. And he says, and as a physicist, and he draws a circle on the whiteboard because it wasn't a blackboard, and says, and this is the model of a cow. And the whole place erupts in laughter. And it's about 9-10 years ago.
Okay.
And he's there doing.
So is it the Universe from Nothing lecture or the CERN cosmology lecture?
I think it's the Universe from Nothing one, because
All
he's
right.
talking about cosmology.
Okay.
He's talking about the beginning, how you estimate things such that 13.9 billion makes sense, etc., etc., etc.
All right.
But literally in like the first 5 minutes, and it's like 10 years old, 9-10 years old, and it's literally draw a circle, and I was surprised he actually manages to draw quite a good circle with one of the black markers that you can then rub off and all the rest of it on a white. But it's like if a circle for a cow works as a model, and the circle therefore can't, in that context, it's simple enough such that you can't game it that easily for a political end. Why are we actually making models so much more complicated such that you can always game them in one way or another? Even something as simple as the retail price index is supposedly based on the monthly, weekly shopping basket, except it's got a PC and a car in it,
right?
Or an annual vacation. We don't make those purchases on a weekly or a monthly basis. But and then it just then, okay, let's take it as being we're that fraction of the 1%. And I've recently had a conversation with a friend of a friend of a friend whose biggest problem is, oh shit, I've just bought another boat, and it's the only sensible place to harbour it is out in the Caribbean. And they live in California. So to get to the boat at the moment that is in St. Thomas on the Mexican Gulf Coast and move it to the Caribbean, it's still a 3,000-mile, 2,000-mile flight. And all I'm going is I'm not counting the cash, I'm counting the carbon. Because they ain't going to drive, they're going to jump on a plane. And hopefully, because I don't know these friends of a friend personally, it's not their plane. At least it's a scheduled airline as opposed to, let's put a 20-seat private jet up and we'll put 3 of us on it. That's a pilot sort of thing.
Yeah, it's weird. The whole, I mean, all of this also kind of, I mean, this business analytics stuff, the spherical cow stuff, the Obsidian graph stuff, really, and the simplifying models to make them useful. And I do think that she does have a point about the power of something that can be written with a pencil or a pen, ballpoint pen on a cocktail napkin, like the Laffer curve. Right. There are plenty of examples of that, of those things actually being very politically, powerful, and and kind of becoming, becoming these excuses. I think you're right, Tim, for things that we wanted to do anyway. Now we've got a little bit of a scientific seeming justification for them. The thing that and this and Haying and Weinstein were talking about that a little bit. We're talking about scientism a little bit in their book as well. One of the things that's been on my mind a lot the last couple of weeks has been this question of humanity, and what we're and partly that's because I've been listening to podcasts. I listen to the All In podcast pretty much every week, and this week once again they were talking about new generative AI, right? And this new thing that's being bolted onto Bard by Google, which is one guy says is so much better than anything else, and is really accurate, and is going to kind of be the thing that really sort of pushes these large language models into the mainstream, because it's going to get bolted on to to Google search and to all of these Google, to the whole kind of raft of Google products, and it'll be out there in the world for people to use. And then it was kind of funny, because then David Sachs, asks it a couple of questions in real time while they're talking. He says, it's hallucinating like mad. It got all, he asked it about himself, and it got a bunch of things that he, that it claimed that he had published that he hadn't. It made up, like 5 articles that, that he never wrote. And then when he interacted with it a little bit more, it managed to sort of correct itself. But the thing that struck me was that people are not going to, people who don't know the actual answer and aren't asking it a question to test it. It has, what my wife calls management confidence, which is sort of like BDE, right? That is going to make it seem authoritative and credible. But then further, I'm also sort of thinking, because I'm also listening to the other podcast that I listen to religiously that comes out once a week on Fridays is America This Week with Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern. And Taibbi's the All In podcast is called the All In podcast, all-in, and it is probably under Jason Calacanis's name, Calcanis, because he's the moderator. The other one is Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern. It's called America This Week, and it is part. I think you can get it out there in the world. I think it's on YouTube, and it is also. I get notified whenever one drops, because I actually subscribe to Taibbi on Substack, and they've been sort of talking about. Last week, their number 37 was called "Take This Internet and Shove It," and it was about kind of walking. It was sort of like that old Ursula Le Guin shorts. I think it was Ursula Le Guin. Maybe it wasn't. Those Who Walked Away from Omelas, short story, science fiction story. I think it was Ursula Le Guin. Omelas is Salem, Oregon backwards. But they have this idea that that it's dead, and we should sort of go our own way. It was really interesting because their podcast begins with the sound of a typewriter and it ends with the sound of a typewriter. So I had this little tagline, and actually listening to it last week, it occurred to me that what that typewriter reminds me of is the long version, the 12-inch version of Thomas Dolby's song "Dissidents: The Search for Truth," because it has a typewriter, kind of sound in it, and that seemed very appropriate, right? But but this week this week they actually started a new segment that apparently they're going to do every week where they read they read short stories. And this week the short story they read was Borges' the Library of Chaos, or the Library of Babel, right, which is only 4 or 5 pages long, and they had some interesting insights into it and compared it to sort of this universe of information. But in any case, I've been going on for a little bit. The thing that really jumped out at me, or the thing that's been kind of on my mind this week and last week, has been, sort of this question of what does it mean to be human, and especially in higher ed, what it is, and I'm in a department called humanities, right? So what is it that what should I be doing to actually, teach students in a world where they're going to have access to these, these all-knowing, or at least seemingly all-knowing oracles of information, to be human?
Yeah, she underlines it with the idea of Homo economicus. And what would you call us otherwise if you don't call us that?
Yeah.
There's Homo sapiens, which falls in the wiseness. I don't think she mentioned that in her list of.
No, she did. She avoided that one.
What would you call us? And that kind of pulled me back to our earlier reading of Annie Murphy Paul, where she talks about imitation and innovation in thinking, and quite often imitation is a much stronger pull than innovation, and innovation is harder to do. But for huge swaths of human evolution, we use the Acheulean axe, and that was a tool and a piece of technology that got copied over and over and over for hundreds of thousands of years with no innovation whatsoever. It was just, we did this thing, and then one day somebody, maybe somebody took a stick and tied the axe onto it and actually took it from being a hand axe to an axe.
Right, with leverage.
And then, and then the world fell apart. But it also, that idea of imitation also kind of ties in with a bigger piece of her thesis. Like, humans are incredibly good at imitating. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that when you draw a simple diagram that's going to light the world on fire, that your diagram be a reasonably good model.
Yeah.
Because that economics diagram that Samuelson drew, in 1948, suddenly becomes the thing we all imitate.
Right.
And we obviously need something better. We can compare that with something else or better and decide, but we also don't know what the long-term effects are of what those little innovations become. And that's one of the issues with all of the innovation that we see, or even social media. Memes are easy to replicate and imitate and spread everywhere.
Yeah. And
then suddenly that becomes the thing. Or maybe even to tie it back into our earlier discussion on weird people. I think I threw earlier a reference to Heinrich's book, which looks at the last 15,000 or 1,500 years of church history, and in making us more weird, the church has used incest and fear of incest as a tool to push out how far away you can marry one of your fellow humans, your third cousin repeated on your mother's side. How far does that go? But in doing that, the church has made the family unit smaller and smaller and smaller. It used to be your village was your family, and in lots of indigenous tribes, they have incredibly complicated oral methods for splitting up, and in anthropology they're called moieties generally. So who's your relative and who's not,
Right.
so that you know 4 or 5 or 10 generations out who can you marry, is one issue for the evolution piece. But then the other issue is who are your people? Who is your tribe within the local people? So that even if you walk halfway across Australia, you'll know that these people are related to you in a weird way, and you're more likely than to share. So we've gone from these big groups, or even in politics, Tammany Hall clans, that you fight your group against the other group. It has nothing to do with what we consider politics now, but back then it was all family and who's getting the money. Now we don't care we care who's getting the money, but for different reasons now. But our groups have become smaller and smaller. So my extended family now maybe includes my parents. It barely includes brothers and sisters, even, because they all live so far away from me. It doesn't really include, I'm not close with cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents, because they also live so far away. So we've been programmed over time to have these smaller and smaller family units.
Yeah.
And what does that mean with respect to our humanity and connection with others? We've become less and less connected to the people in both our families and our communities. I have connections in social media, but I don't have the same, I don't go to the Elks Lodge or the Moose Lodge every week for my entertainment to see friends and family. I don't go have lunch at the Lions Club or Rotary, which were things less than a generation ago, and they almost don't exist now as a thing.
It's true.
Or the things that do exist that are like that, the local clubs are, the local country club, they do some programming, but usually it's individuals and small families going and not interacting with each other. Right. They're interacting within their family unit, but they're ignoring all the people around them as if they don't exist. And
yeah, as Maggie said back in the 80s, there's no such thing as society.
Yes, society. Yeah, you did say that. Yeah, it's interesting because also the there's this guy, the shy historian, who that particular video that I linked to was about how inbred King Charles is, but he's apparently really focused on this idea of inbreeding. So his channel seems to be all about inbreeding and coefficient of consanguinity. But another thing that sort of that what you said, Chris, reminded me of was that the idea of innovation. This other book, and maybe I'm talking about it so much that maybe I should put it on the candidate list for future reading. They actually sort of create this spectrum of culture on one side and consciousness on the other, right? Where culture are the things that have become kind of baked into our experience, right? Language and these sort of things, and the way they position them, because they're evolutionary biologists, is that they are adaptive, right? Until the circumstances change, and then you have to sort of shift from culture to consciousness once again, and actually kind of think things through and find new solutions and all that sort of thing. And so that was I thought that was a kind of an interesting way to sort of look at that tension between tradition and innovation.
It kind of reminds me a bit of, and I don't know what has got me on this kick, but there's a through line about humans and fallibility in my notes that I'm picking up through multiple sources. And I literally wrote in the margin, and I guess it ties into AI too, because we have human bias that then gets programmed into our artificial intelligence, and people are ignoring it and pretending these AIs are these fantastic oracles that just have all the answers, when generally they don't, but they're also being built to have the same biases we do.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a fallibility there. But if you think about from an economics perspective, we talk about markets in this super abstract way, and we pretend that, or at least some will pretend that, the markets and capitalism are going to solve all the problems.
Mm-hmm.
And they conveniently ignore a lot of the problems that capitalism can't solve and is never going to solve, because we've been programmed to think that they are. But when you think of it, at the core, markets they're made out of humans and human decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And those things aggregate over time. So if you start out with the presumption that humans are fallible, and I think we are dramatically so, and even worse, when we get together in groups, we become even more fallible.
Mm-hmm.
But if humans are fallible, then markets are and can be fallible because they're made of humans.
Right.
And then when you have that, but your belief in the market is all encompassing, you're believing in that fallibility. So then when something like the downturn in 2008 happens, you brush it all under the rug and you say, who cares? Let's not fix anything, because you believe in the market. Well, if you believed in the market, you'd have let all those banks fail,
Mm-hmm.
and we would have started again.
Right.
And somehow it always seems convenient to, brush that stuff under the rug, rather than saying, oh yes, we have this belief, so let's stick to that core belief. But there's something interesting about that kind of human fallibility being built into the bigger process.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost kind of wish he had talked about that, or the ability to do that, because we don't ever acknowledge it, and it's a problem in almost every model I see.
Right. Right. Well, I think she does on 85. She does mention that that it sort of got baked out of the cake, right? Because she says Milton Friedman reinforces Knight's justifications, where he defends the cartoon character. He argues that since in real life people behaved as if they were making self-interested, all-knowing calculations based on ascribed to rational economic man, Homo economicus, then the simplified assumptions and the cartoon character they depicted were legitimate, right? So this idea of rationality, of perfect knowledge, kind of get baked into, and perfect, I mean, rationality, perfect knowledge, and perfect competition are kind of the assumptions that are baked into, every economic model. And none of them are real. And none of them are actually accurate. The other thing that strikes me about all of this is sort of the triviality of these answers that we get that are based on this kind of analysis, right? That they are, I mean, really, I mean, and what AI is doing, right, is they are taking they're giving you the answer that is right under the standard deviation, or right under the peak of the normal curve, right? 0.00, kind of offset from the peak of the curve, right? And so that's where, so I guess part of it is sort of that we need to begin to distinguish between knowledge and insight, or knowledge and ideas, because the answers that we're getting are not going to be at all creative.
Yeah, or not knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah,
because I can give you all the knowledge I have, but in doing so, I won't necessarily have given you any of the wisdom I've collected along the way while I gathered that knowledge.
Right.
And those two, you know, if you could, as a teacher, it's easy to give your student knowledge, but it's super hard to give them wisdom.
Yeah.
And you usually only get that by failing at the thing. But we also put such pressure on students to not fail. The whole point of school, if you look at it, seems to be, you know, you need to succeed, and success is the only thing, rather than framing it as, yes, you need to fail and fail a million times,
Right.
so that when opportunities for success present themselves, you can see that and take advantage of it. And the educational system does a horrible job of that in general.
But I hate to bring Obsidian back into it.
Okay.
But Nicola van der Hoven's last YouTube, which came out yesterday. She went off to a conference to talk on emergence as the biological evolutionary idea, but in other contexts, as in emergence from software, emergence from taking notes into Obsidian, etc., was part of her thing. And she had she outlined like a 5-step process. And the last step was take the knowledge and apply it in a different context to check the wisdom of the knowledge. As in a rewording of what Chris has just commented on. But I also think that school or education institutions should be sufficiently, and I hate to use it, places of safe space that you can fail. You can make a mess. I mean, one of the things I found, particularly when I first came here, or not first came here, but I've been here a couple of years, 3 years maybe, and I periodically got roped into HR training that went literally down to the level of a cleaner. So you've got basic staff all the way up to a director level in the same classroom being taught about a new policy or a new mechanism for staff appraisals, etc. And you were expected as the attendee to then span that thing out. But a bit like you often get in groups that are very mixed and groups that don't necessarily know each other as a person, as opposed to, oh shit, he's the guy with an office that walks past me in the mornings. Yeah, but video for Nicola is literally in the last 2 days, depending on your time stamp.
Well, there's one that's called More Than Just Taking Notes.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay, I'll put a link to that in.
And so while we might be visually known, they don't necessarily know what you do or where you actually sit, etc. So Lillian, bless her cotton socks, who was one of the trainers from HR, who was a Kikiro Kenyu, would always rack the table at the start when we try to get everybody to settle down to start, and would always start with no speaking of native language, at which point the standard response is, I get up to leave. And I only do it when I'm the senior person in the room, because it puts me down at the same level as everybody else, because I get up to leave because British English is my only language, let alone my native language. And I'm sitting in a room where, on average, there are 4 languages per person, because that's what everybody else does. You know, I've got a Russian-speaking Kazakh who also speaks English as well, and maybe German or French or Chinese even. And I've got a Kikuyu Kenyan who's got 3 African languages, Arabic and English, etc., etc. So it takes the sting out of a strange boss because I'm dressed differently, I'm not in uniform, whereas almost everybody else is. And therefore, they can be open, more open than they would be if they just knew, oh shit, there's a boss in the room. And that's a big problem here, for sure. And it's less of a problem back in the UK, and presumably for you guys. But you must be experiencing it where it's not even necessarily a racial thing or a cultural thing. It's just confidence level.
Mm-hmm.
As well, as in I'm being given some basic knowledge, I now need to apply it, because until I apply it, I can't see necessarily the wisdom of why am I even doing a staff appraisal, almost. And I still worry about that question occasionally. But no, there's that common thing about why do I need to be taught maths when I'm providing I can balance the checkbook? I don't need calculus type stuff. And yet you can very quickly talk about something if you only use words without any equations being mentioned, and you can talk through a number of physical examples, and then to slide across the table a piece of paper that's got the equations and a graph on, back to graphs. And oh yes, now I understand. You know, as in I need my cannonball to go in the right ditch. So it's a parabola nearly perfectly, because wind resistance isn't that much to a small cannonball, mostly, etc., etc., etc. But no Aristotle or Socratic method involved in this at all. I hope. But oddly enough, Nicola mentions that in passing and talking about learning, taking notes, what to do, how to do. There's not a lot of Obsidian mention other than that's the graphic she's showing you, putting it in and evolving the notes and modifying the notes for the next purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of the several various YouTubers that over the last 2 months have stopped worrying too much about which plugin to use, what settings are, etc. But this is how I actually do it, and this is how I get something out at the end.
Yeah.
As opposed to, oh, I've got 30,000 notes. What am I going to do with them?
Right. Right. Well, that will I'll spend more time looking at her, because that is kind of the challenge that I kind of found myself struggling with Obsidian. And I kind of mentioned that maybe more than Nick probably wanted to me when I was talking with him last week in that thing.
Well, the other one that's come up with the same, there is, and I can't remember which one it is, but there's one that is pointed at university students PhD level, master's level. But there's also Morgan, who's a Canadian PhD student who I think the last 2 have all been the mechanism of getting stuff into Readwise or whatever out into Obsidian and then out into a piece of work going out.
Who's that?
Morgan something. So it's Morgan with a couple of extra letters on the name. And she's a Canadian, Toronto-based PhD student on theatre. So her thing, narrow stuff. He's circus and juggling, I think, from memory.
Oh, Morgan EUA.
Something, yeah, EUA. Which for here, I was surprised she was in Toronto. I thought she might be here.
Mm-hmm.
But she does half-ish of her videos on the mechanism of using note taking and why you take notes and what you do with them. And the other half is, I've read this book and I like the book, and it's a book review or a
on that. Sorry.
set of books. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we got her multiple ways. Cool. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, I think it's interesting because I think this is kind of what Rayworth is going to as well, right? With this, when she kind of begins talking about this portrait of the 21st century person who she wants to talk about in her economics, right? That it's that it's more sort of oriented toward, and that I guess also is my question about the whole eudaimonia idea is, yeah, okay, cool. So how do we assess that? What are the learning outcomes that you associate with that, and how do we measure them? But her things on and they're on 87, right, under the 21st century portrait, are social, that we're social and reciprocating, that we have fluid values, that it'll be interesting to see her elaborate that we're interdependent, obviously, that we approximate rather than believe in, so it'll be interesting to see how that corresponds to her idea that she's drawing a new diagram, and then that we're embedded in kind of in these planetary systems. So
well, it that piece too, in a synoptical reading of where she's going and some of that piece there, I'm reminded, and she talks around it. I don't think she gets to the heart of it the way David Graeber does in Bullshit Jobs, where he looks at, here are moral values and here are economic values, and the two clash dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
And then by trying to equate the two and create some general value framework that subsumes both, that seems to be a super painful, non-humanistic thing to do, because each group of people, each culture, each society, and to a great extent, maybe humanity is becoming one more homogenized version of itself because we have social media. And I can see how people live halfway across the world, but there's also that pressure of those people who live halfway across the world are, because of colonialism, pressured to live the same way I do, which is part of that weird phenomena in psychology of, we take all these psychological studies and we only do them on weird people, so we're going to get weird
right
answers.
And there's a value in performing your life in a particular way. Yeah.
But and anthropology took a horrible turn in the late 1800s as it was being born, really, because of colonialist pressures, nationalistic pressures, and idiotic things like, turns of, I guess, bad evolutionary theory,
Mm-hmm.
And eugenics, and our group is better than your group.
Mm-hmm.
And
a kind of a white gaze sort of a thing.
We need a better way of not putting our personal values on other cultures, although there are cultures that practice cannibalism, and maybe the majority of cultures would say cannibalism is probably not a good thing. But we do too much of saying, hey, the way you're living is not the right way to live.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes the even root question when you think about eudaimonia is there is a way to live, and there's certainly a great way that Aristotle thought you should live.
Mm-hmm.
Is that necessarily the best way, and or if it is, why?
Yeah. Yeah. And is your and what do you have to do? What do you have to perform or demonstrate in order for me to believe that you are having this valuable experience? So Mark had to leave before John got to weigh in, but go ahead, John, weigh in, and we will get Mark. We'll get a recording of it up so that Mark can see it.
Well, I don't know if anyone watched the CNN town hall, but it was a particular kind of spectacular example of complete self-interest economically.
Mm-hmm.
I think Trump was asked about how would he, reinvigorate the economy because he was, describing it as completely torn back down.
Drill, baby, drill.
Said, right. Drill, baby, drill, right? And he got a huge applause.
Yep.
As if it was so simple. And
yeah.
That was the astonishing part to me, is it was the reaction to when he said that. And of course he was serious because simple things sell very well, which he understands. But it was a very interesting we're looking at these theories about self-interest, and that was pure self-interest without any notion of the complexity of what that means. The whole systems approach of, he declared we're standing on the greatest oil reserve in the world, and why aren't we using it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was just amazing.
Well, but he doesn't understand. He has no knowledge of why we're not using it. Or what the consequences of using it might be. And
that it would not solve a problem because it's the oil companies that own it, and they're going to sell it at world prices.
Yeah.
And if they dump it onto the world market, guess what? Other countries react by restricting their outflow. So you haven't accomplished anything, really.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fine. Well, and that numerically there is more money in, and there's actually already more employment in the renewable energy space than there is in fossil fuels. It's just that that the profits of that fossil fuel business are so concentrated in these legacy, very, very, very powerful organizations and politically, wired organizations that we're not going to get to, it would be a net economic gain. It would be a boon to the economy to switch. But we're never going to get to have that discussion at all. So yeah, it's frustrating. And the other thing that struck me was just that, how, because CNN got hammered for putting that thing on. And to me, it was just so obviously a response to their horrible, horrible competitive position as far as the ratings went, that they figure, we could go back to the golden age of 24/7 relevance if we would just have Trump back in the White House to oppose.
Yeah, including stacking the audience with Republicans in New Hampshire.
Yeah. So be careful what you wish for.
Well, the bigger problem is we let Trump get up and say whatever the hell he feels like saying, right? And no one is holding his feet to the fire of, okay, you can say drill, baby, drill, but let's look 2 more levels deep into what that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And I almost feel like too much of American, and Rayworth makes this point. We've got the cuckoo of GDP and growth built into our economics. And I think too much of America feels like if there isn't growth, then there's no room for me to exist and have a living.
Right.
And we need to grow dramatically because all the uber rich people, let's say even during the pandemic, the people who grew and improved the most in terms of wealth were the uber rich, who added billions and billions while everyone else kind of slid further down in comparison.
Yeah.
So it's only if we are growing at logarithmic rates is there going to be room for me, the average American Joe. And even then, I'm only getting table scraps rather than let's grow, but let's grow in a way that improves my life a little more than it does the rich guy.
Right. Well, and it's again, it's that oversimplified diagram of the rising tide raising all the ships, right? But the tide doesn't rise uniformly in that way, right? That's just not
the tide might, except I don't have a ship. I've got a bit of flotsam, as you see in, say, like the Titanic. The high polloi might well be on the Titanic to start with, but we're being chucked off it. We might get lucky and get a lifeboat. But the thing that I thought from watching the CNN host goes viral and with a couple of other reports was CNN put him in a room with supporters. And then thought that an otherwise relatively photogenic but weak moderator would be enough to make it a level playing field.
Right.
That is such a clusterfuck. It's unbelievable. Right?
No.
So, who in their right mind would even think, given all the other interviews he's done, where he's effectively totally ignored the interviewer come moderator, right? To the extreme of insulting them, never mind not particularly answering the question asked,
right?
As a normal politician, even, let alone. So to me, this is on a par for CNN as, oh dear, we just lost a court case, response, fire Tucker.
Yeah.
As opposed to, let's fire Tucker because we know we got a court case coming up. And then we admit that we've got a whole big dirt book on Tucker so he can't sue us for breach of contract.
Right.
Which hasn't started yet, but is muted.
Apparently that is not going to work.
Well, you never know. One of the things that has happened in my group of social media, way back when I first went on the internet, I went via an ISP, which was a very British one, but they ran a very text-driven, difficult to put pictures up, but you could, equivalent of Facebook.
Yeah.
And to get it rolling, they took the business decision that they would invite like the first 1,000 people to have a free account. And those people would they would be known as John, Chris and Dan, for instance. They wouldn't need to put their whole name in. And then once you got away from that, you had to put your whole handle in, not necessarily your name.
And then you weren't as cool because you weren't on the first name basis.
Absolutely. Yeah. I got it through the company I was working for. So I was T. Bushel because I didn't have a choice. And most of those people have migrated to Facebook now. And the old ISP still exists as an ISP. It just doesn't do the social media thing so much. But in this context, somewhere that has just happened, there's been an award to Hewlett and Packard for the guy that sold them a software product like 10 years ago. It's been in court for the last 6 years plus, both in the UK and the US, because apparently he sold them a pup. And what they didn't do was a decent amount of due diligence. And they've now managed to get him on a bad selling thing. As in, well, okay, what did your audit of my books tell you? And quite a few of the people are IT-orientated journalists who got the old social media for free, have all waded in with their old stories from upwards of 10 years ago, saying this was like the 15th time that Hewlett and Packard had done it, and now they're being rewarded for being stupid because they seem to have won the next round of whatever's happening on the court case. And so, I can't. Why did CNN think that he would be any different than he was before the election that even got him in? never mind the election he lost, which of course was never going to come up, but clearly did.
It was all right.
Anyway.
And on that note of rigged elections, next week the chapters will be called Get Savvy with Systems and Design to Distribute. So that sounds promising.
So the two high engineering chapter titles.
Yeah, so we'll see if they pay it off with high engineering concepts.
And it splits the rest of the book pretty evenly too, in terms of chapter 6 and 7 after. So
yep. And then the conclusion and the appendix maybe.
But it also means it's time to start picking the book that comes after, so that everybody has time to buy it. So
true. And I will put a link to that other one that I'm reading up in case anyone's interested. Or we can go back through. It's been a week or so since I've kind of looked through to see what other.
Which book was that, Dan?
That one is called A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century by Haying and Weinstein.
So Chris has linked it for you.
What's that?
I think
they have a podcast. Have you ever listened to it?
I haven't. I heard her on somebody's podcast just in the last couple of days, and that's what alerted me to the fact of the book. So and actually in the audiobook they ping pong back and forth narrating the chapters. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, okay. They're very interesting.
Yeah.
We do.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you. I'll see you next week.
Next week.
Have a good one.
Cool. Thanks, Dan.